Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's CID speaker series. I'm Kevin, a freshman at Harvard College. Today's discussion is on Behind the Curve, Can Manufacturing Still Provide Inclusive Growth? With Professor Robert Lawrence. The format for today's session is a 20 to 25-minute presentation and around 20 minutes for Q&A. Before we get started, I want to mention a few housekeeping items. During the Q&A, you can submit questions directly in the chat or the Q&A function, and I'll read aloud to Professor Lawrence. We're also recording today's session, and the videos of this event will be available on CID's YouTube channel. Our next speaker series is on Friday, April 22nd at our normal time, 12 p.m. Eastern, with Arsalan Metaphor, Executive Director at JP Morgan's Development Finance Institution, on the topic of mobilizing capital markets towards sustainable development. We hope you'll join us. But without further ado, I would like to briefly introduce our speaker for today. Professor Robert Lawrence is the Albert L. Williams Professor of International Trade and Investment at Harvard Kennedy School, a senior fellow at the Peterson Institute of International Economics, and a research associate at the National Bureau of Economic Research. Professor Lawrence's research focuses on issues in global integration and international trade. The floor is yours, Professor Lawrence.
Thank you very much. Can you see my screen? So it's a pleasure for me to talk to you today. I'm actually going to give you a flavor of the results of a book. I've just completed a manuscript with the same title as this talk, basically exploring whether manufacturing can play its traditional role in generating economic growth in general and growth that is inclusive in particular. So I'll begin by looking at the profile of the share of manufacturing employment as countries develop. And I hope to persuade you of is that countries have a lot in common, that this profile seems to be characteristic of virtually every country in the world as it develops. Yet, if we look at discussions about industrial policy and policies towards manufacturing, people seem unaware of this powerful force. So, if you ask what's the typical profile of sector shares in economic growth, well, traditionally, what we would say is that the share of agriculture declines as countries get richer, the share of services rises, but the share of manufacturing, as you can see from this equation, fitted from 1950 to 2012, on a sample of 18 different countries, is that it has followed a hump. During the initial phases, the share of manufacturing employment rises, and then it declines. And here again, a bigger sample of countries, and we see the same humped experience is captured by fitting a curve. If we actually look at the United States, here's a chart which shows the share of agriculture, manufacturing, and other, basically services, going back for 200 years. And again, what you see is that there is this hump-shaped profile to the share of manufacturing employment. This chart is also interesting because what it shows us, as the earlier curves that I showed you also show you, is that even when countries are rather poor, the share of services exceeds the share of manufacturing. And throughout the development process, the share of employment in services actually grows more rapidly than the share of employment in manufacturing. Traditionally, most people describe the development process as a movement from agriculture to industry to services. But what this chart shows us is, in fact, while manufacturing does increase during the initial phases of growth, it's services that tend to dominate throughout the whole growth process. And this is a global phenomenon. Here are curves fitted to a full global sample of 40 different countries, developed countries. And what you'll notice there is that most of them have passed their peaks and are to the right of the curve. Developing countries, many of which are in the initial phases of expansion. And then Africa, Asia, Latin America, Europe, we find the curve almost everywhere. And perhaps surprisingly, if you look at countries with trade surpluses, I ranked 50 countries in terms of the share of the manufacturing trade surplus relative to their GDPs, and I chose the top 10. And what you can see from this chart is that France, Sweden, United Kingdom, Italy, South Korea, very noticeably, Japan, these countries, developed countries, have all passed their peaks. We see China in the initial phases experiencing a rise in its employment share. We also see Germany experiencing a decline, and even Zambia has a hump. Deficit countries, on the other hand, have humps, although their profiles are much less regular. What's remarkable is that this hump even applies to China. Somewhere around 2012, 2013, the employment share in China peaked, and China is now on the declining part of the curve. And this summarizes the experience of 60 countries over the period from 1995 to 2011. And what you can see in the circled part of this chart is that the declines in employment shares in those countries that had trade surpluses of basically 4.4% percentage points was, if anything, larger than the decline in the countries with the largest trade deficits. So whether you have a deficit, whether you have a surplus, once you've passed the peak, you're on the downward slope of that hump. And it also is true if we took the same period and looked at countries who had net positive changes in their trade or negative changes in their trade, we again get a similar story. It doesn't seem to make much difference. Now, so my first point, and I hope I've driven it home, perhaps to you too much, is that there is this experience that countries share in common. And it is very vital as they think about strategies to increase their manufacturing employment, that they understand this. Just as almost all countries experience declining shares in agricultural employment, so I think it's fair to say that countries experience this decline in manufacturing employment once they pass its peak. My second point is that the hump has actually been shifting downward over time. So if we fit these curves using decade dummies, what we see at the global level is the downward shift. And this is true of both developed and developing countries. It's very true of Africa, of Asia, Latin America, and Europe. So this is a second important feature of the data. Moreover, it's not just that the curve has been shifting downward, it's also been shifting towards the origin, to the left. That is to say, countries are achieving their peak manufacturing shares at lower levels of income. So here are some examples. In America and the United Kingdom, the US share of employment in manufacturing peaked in 1953, when America had a real per capita income, these are in 2010 dollars, of about $18,000, and its share was 25%. The United Kingdom in 1961 peaked at 32%, with an income of $15,000. But if we look at BRICS countries like South Africa, Brazil, and China, who peaked later, we see the peaks are lower and they occur at lower levels of income. This has become known, particularly for developing countries, as the phenomenon of premature deindustrialization. But it has major consequences, obviously. What it means is that these countries are less able to afford people who are leaving agriculture to obtain jobs in manufacturing. Let me show you the example of the United States. But before turning to that, manufacturing has historically been a source of growth and inclusion, particularly in developed countries. What obtaining a job in manufacturing did was to allow workers who didn't have a lot of education to find a relatively decent paying job and enter the middle class. The development of manufacturing employment was also associated with political developments, such as unions, who also, in many countries, were a major force for inclusion. Manufacturing production is relatively mobile. And what we see during the period in which manufacturing was flourishing, and we could use the United States again as an example, was that the poorer parts of the country were able to converge to the richer parts of the country by attracting manufacturing firms. In developing countries, the transition to manufacturing has been associated with very rapid growth. Developing countries typically have lower productivity levels in agriculture, and by moving workers into manufacturing, can generate an acceleration in their growth rates. Manufacturing has also been associated with scale economies, backward and forward linkages, and by exporting, countries can actually escape the limitations of their small markets. They can export, they can obtain foreign exchange, they can use it to buy technologies. They've also been able to attract foreign direct investment and obtain know-how. So manufacturing has obviously been a major driver of growth. But more recently, manufacturing's role has diminished. The shares of manufacturing employment, as I've already indicated, are declining in many developed and some developing countries. Another feature is that the processes of production in manufacturing have become increasingly skill and capital intensive. And what that means is that it's no longer as easy to obtain jobs if you're a less skilled worker. And as less educated men have felt left out, as their incomes have not risen as rapidly as before, we've seen an outbreak of right-wing populism. And so many of the political developments we're currently dealing with reflect these developments that are driven in part by what's been happening to the manufacturing sector. The deindustrialization, the downward shift, has meant that there are fewer opportunities for workers in manufacturing in developing countries, and this drives more workers to have to seek jobs in services, often informality. Now, just to give you a more concrete, some concrete data on the American example, in the 1960s, manufacturing accounted for about 30% of annual US growth, which was averaging 4.5% a year. In the last decade, by contrast, manufacturing has only accounted for about 10% of American GDP growth, and overall US GDP growth has slowed to 2.3%. We can ascribe about 40% of the deceleration in American growth to the shrinkage of the manufacturing sector. In 1970, 36% of men without college employment were able to find a job in US manufacturing. And by 2019, that share had fallen to 16%. And so the US has not only experienced a declining share of manufacturing employment, but during the decade after 2000, experienced the loss of about 5.8 million manufacturing jobs. Now, manufacturing jobs are especially important in America for men. And what we can also see is that they're even more important for men who don't have a college degree. And if we look at what's happened to the earnings of men without a college degree in the United States, here I show you annual earnings between 1970 and 2019. And I have women with and without college degrees and men with and without college degrees. Although the women are paid less than the men, regardless of whether they have a college or a degree or not, men with a college degree have experienced a growth from around $60,000 a year in 1980 to closer to $90,000 today. By contrast, we see almost no growth over 5 decades in the earnings of the median male in the United States who doesn't have a college degree. And this means that these men have not shared in the economic growth that we have experienced in the US. And I think it goes quite a way to explain the kinds of political developments that we've seen, for instance, in the election of Donald Trump. We've also seen these men dropping out in large numbers of the labor force, so that their slow income growth actually understates their plight as a consequence of the lack of opportunities they have found because of this structural change. So what explains the hump? Well, I've developed a theory, a simple theory, which combines basically 2 forces. The first is productivity growth. Here I show you the productivity growth output per worker, and actually it's total factor productivity in manufacturing. And also the prices have followed productivity growth. Actually, this is the inverse of prices. So the faster productivity growth leads to a decline in the price of manufactured goods. There's a second feature, in addition to productivity growth, which is the income elasticity of demand for goods. And what you see is the poorest households devote much higher shares of their spending to goods than do the richer ones. So putting these together, you can actually develop a simple model. If you had a closed economy where just labor was the productive factor, and you assume a particular ranking, You assume productivity growth is very rapid in agriculture. It's somewhat slower in manufacturing and very slow in services. And you assume the income demand elasticity is rapid in services, somewhat slower in manufacturing, and even slower in agriculture. And in addition, you assume that in the aggregate, the demand elasticity for manufactured products, for all products, is less than 1. This is quite a plausible assumption for a big aggregate like all manufactured goods. Well then, as countries develop, you have 2 forces at play. Very rapid growth in productivity in the agricultural sector leads food prices to fall. People respond to cheaper food by spending more of their money on manufacturing and services. So this serves as a force to increase the share of employment in manufacturing. By contrast, if there is rapid productivity growth in manufacturing itself, in a closed economy, people will spend less of their money on manufacturing and more on services or food. So the result is we have 2 forces at work. And when the agricultural sector is very large, it's the first force that dominates. Fast productivity growth in agriculture is an impulse which leads to an expansion in manufacturing employment. But once the agricultural sector shrinks, that force diminishes, and what we're left with is rapid productivity growth in manufacturing itself, which in turn leads to a decline in manufacturing employment. I simulate my model. I have this this elasticity of substitution of just 0.7, and what you see is the model generates exactly the profile which we saw was characteristic of economic development in general. If we add in trade to this theory, what we do find is that if a country is an importer, it's likely to find that it reaches its peak at a lower level, the red line, than if the country has balanced trade. It's also likely to be able to achieve a lower share of manufacturing employment. By contrast, an exporter, the green curve, peaks later and has a higher share of manufacturing employment. So the main point in this theoretical framework is that, yes, running an export surplus leads to more employment in manufacturing and to a higher peak share, but it does not avoid the hump. Even exporters in this simple theory will experience declining shares in their manufacturing employment. And that's what I showed you is true in the data. So what explains the downward shifts? What explains this premature deindustrialization phenomenon? There are 3 possible candidates. The first would be an acceleration in productivity in manufacturing relative to services. The second would be globalization, if more and more countries are actually running deficits. And in a sense, trade, there are fewer surplus countries in the sample. And a third factor, which is often not mentioned, is that demand could actually, the income elasticity of demand could be declining. I, again, simulate my model, and what I find is, and I'll just take you through the example of manufacturing productivity growth. If manufacturing productivity growth is more rapid, what we see we start with a baseline, which is this blue curve. If you get a positive shock in manufacturing productivity, you're going to find that the curve shifts downward. And that's kind of what you'd expect. You can now meet the needs of people at any income level using fewer workers if your technology is better. But it is also the case that if their demand is inelastic, they're going to spend more of the money they save from cheaper manufactured goods in buying services. So the leftward shift is explained by the fact that the share of services will rise as manufactured goods get relatively cheap. And what I show you in the right panel is what happens to the share of employment in services. A very similar logic, and I don't have time to go through it, would apply if you run a trade deficit. You also see this downward shift and to movement to the left. And you'll also see it in the case of demand. If you have a declining income elasticity of demand, what you'll find is that the share of services will rise and the share of manufacturing will fall. I then explore the relative power of each of these three explanations in explaining premature deindustrialization. And what I find is that the powerful explanatory variables come from, firstly, productivity growth, and secondly, a declining share in manufacturing investment, which is prevalent in many, many countries around the world. A second factor that I find is important is the fact that fixed investment today increasingly is less intensive in equipment and in structures, the kind of things we can touch, physical examples of capital, and more intensive in intellectual property products, things like software and databases and intellectual property. And so these have the effect of reducing the demand for manufactured products as countries grow. Let me summarize because I'm reaching the end of my allotted time. My takeaways in explaining premature deindustrialization are that trade does account for some of this phenomenon, but somewhat idiosyncratically. We do find in numerous countries that even though you may have a bigger trade surplus, one of the drivers of that trade surplus is often that you're more productive in manufacturing. That's the classic Ricardian theory. And if you're more productive in manufacturing, it's going to turn out that you actually have domestic spending, which allocates a smaller share to manufactured goods. So what these countries gain through their net exports, they tend to lose as a result of having lower spending shares on manufacturing. In addition, over time, as their productivity increases, the job content of any given trade surplus declines. And so that trade becomes less of a stimulatory factor. And in the long run, the hump takes over. And even those surplus countries experience declining employment shares in manufacturing. It's very important to appreciate that productivity is a major story, because in many countries, we're seeing the adoption of industrial policies today that try to enhance productivity growth. Now, productivity growth is a very good thing in its own right. It will lead to higher living standards, but it can also do two things when it comes to the question of inclusion. Firstly, a more productive manufacturing sector in the face of unresponsive demand can actually mean fewer jobs in manufacturing rather than more jobs. And more sophisticated technologies can lead to skill-biased technical change and actually mean more jobs for a greater share of jobs for college-educated workers than those who don't have such high skills. In addition, declining investment rates are very important. Investment is typically much more manufacturing intensive because a big part of investment involves investing in equipment. But as the investment shares have fallen around the world, we've seen that impulse being less important as a source of manufacturing employment. I also want to leave you with the impression that while if you study any country, you're going to get interpretations of why their manufacturing sector has been losing jobs. Often the debate is between those who blame trade and those who blame automation. But what's ignored in those discussions is typically the role of demand and the fact that the hump is a very common phenomenon which countries share from one another, and that needs to be included in the interpretation. Yes, trade performance can affect the outcome, but the hump prevails in countries with a comparative advantage, as you've seen, as well as those with a comparative disadvantage. In addition, you can actually see that if you want to explain premature deindustrialization, trade sometimes plays a role, and our colleague Danny Roderick has found this to be true in the case of Latin America and in Africa. In my work, though, what I find is that far more powerful than trade is increasing productivity in manufacturing and decreasing shares of investment. And all of these trends are being exacerbated by skill-biased technical change, which further reduces the demand for unskilled workers. My view is that we need to adjust our economic policies to appreciate that most of the jobs for those who do not have college degrees are not going to be found in manufacturing. Manufacturing may be a place where we want to promote technological development and drive some of our economic growth. But if it's inclusion we're seeking, many of the industrial policies that we're currently seeing emphasized, such as the emphasis on digital technologies, even when it comes to green technologies like electric vehicles, those are not the kind of technologies that are going to enhance inclusion. So I'm not against the adoption of those technologies, but I believe we need even more policies that make our growth more equitable. So I'll end there and be happy to take your questions.
Thank you, Professor Lawrence, for such a comprehensive presentation. The model on productivity and demand elasticity is a very enlightening explanation for this phenomenon. So at this point, we're going to open up for Q&A now, and you can add your questions to the chat. There has already been a few in the chat as seen. So we'll start out with Carlo Rodriguez's question, asking if the model that you've made assumes no change in savings or investment. Yes,
in its simplest version, we simply have productivity. We have only labor, and we don't change investment. Later, when we look at why there may have been premature deindustrialization, we incorporate the role of investment. Investment, if you look at China, for instance, China is the country which had the highest share of employment in manufacturing. And if you ask, why did China have such a high share of employment in manufacturing? Many people might point to trade, but it actually played a relatively small role, even when China had pretty large trade surpluses. The big role was China's high investment rates. Investment is twice as manufacturing value-added intensive as is consumption. So that the Chinese have a typical share of consumption in terms of how much manufacturing value-added they generate, but the dominant role really does come from investment. So investment is a very important source of generating manufacturing employment. Great. Even though it's been diminishing over time.
I see. Terila Moses asks, how does the offshoring of manufacturing jobs by multinational companies in developed countries factor into your model?
Well, I do have a chapter which looks very carefully at what role trade played, both imports and offshoring, in that loss of jobs that I showed you had taken place in the United States. You know, the famous paper by our colleague, where our colleague Gordon Hanson was a co-author, dealt with the China shock, which incorporates offshoring to China. They find that they can explain something like a 1 million job decline due to the China shock over the decade after 2000. Actually, over the same period, American employment in manufacturing fell by almost 6 million. So the China shock was about 16% of the total loss of jobs if we use their numbers. And of course, that isn't a net effect of international trade, because there were offsetting gains by American exporters. So my view is that, yes, there have been negative effects from offshoring. They have been particularly important for certain communities in the United States, but they are by far not the dominant reason why Americans experienced declining employment growth after 2000. The dominant reasons are a combination of more rapid productivity growth in manufacturing and the fact, which is rarely commented on, that the United States had 2 recessions during that period and very slow overall economic growth. And what I find is the demand for manufactured goods, as you would expect, is highly cyclical and sensitive to the business cycle. So whereas most people are debating were the robots taking our jobs or were the Chinese taking our jobs, I feel that they don't pay enough attention to the fact that we had 2 big recessions in the United States over the same period, and they account for a big share of the job loss in manufacturing.
Great. Yuriko Nakajima asked, well, this is the first comment, industrialization, which has supported mass production and mass consumption, has created a large number of jobs. But as the service sector becomes more important, the growth rate of industrialization in developing countries might not be so promising in the future due to digitalization, aging populations, and environmental concerns. So the question is, how does the contribution of digitalization affects this phenomenon?
Yes, well, you know, I'm a two-handed economist. Yes, I think digitalization has been very fundamental. What we find is the use of computers tends to be very complementary to skilled workers and educated workers, and can substitute for unskilled workers. And in that sense, it can lead to less inclusive growth. There is, however, a question that maybe leaves more room for optimism. Digitalization and the experience of COVID has allowed us to has made remote work much more viable. And potentially developing countries, and indeed even people who work in rural areas, now have an increasing opportunities to take jobs either in other countries or to provide services to other countries, or to live in rural areas and provide jobs in cities. So I think this is a big unknown, and we don't yet see the full effects of it, but it could be quite positive. Another effect of digitalization is, of course, in the facilitation of e-commerce. And that has allowed for many niche producers from developing countries and elsewhere to sell globally. It's dramatically reduced some of the transactions costs involved in international trade. We've also seen the development of e-finance in various forms. So the net of digitization, the net effects are complex. We can see positive effects, but we can also see negative effects as a consequence. Most people, of course, point to robots and to things like 3D printing, which could now allow for products to be produced locally rather than to be produced in labor-intensive activities in developing countries. So this is one other potentially negative force that is at play. So I can't give you a straight answer to this, but I do believe digitalization is inevitable, and it really increases the importance of acquiring skills using digital technologies in order to take advantage of the opportunities that it affords.
Great. To wrap up with somewhat of a bigger question that is kind of the crux of this phenomenon is that since we know here that there is the phenomenon of premature deindustrialization happening across the globe for developing countries, and that raising productivity might have negative effects on manufacturing jobs, what therefore can governments do to boost incomes or social mobility for the least educated to enhance inclusion and economic growth?
Well, that's the $64,000 question. One part of this is emphasizing to a much greater degree than countries do how to enhance productivity growth in services. We have Ministry of Industries, we have industrial policies, but it's striking to me that we pay much less attention to how we can enhance productivity growth in services. The second point, which I think particularly applies to places like the United States, but also elsewhere as well, is that a lot of emphasis, I think too much emphasis, is placed by employers on people acquiring formal educational degrees as a way to signal, that they're smart. In fact, what we find is that there are many jobs that potentially can be entry into a ladder that can lead to higher paying jobs that actually don't require a college degree, but do require obtaining skills and expertise in particular activities and in particular production processes. So I think much greater investment on the one hand by those who work in obtaining methods of signaling that they are competent, but not necessarily by going to college. And on the other hand, a willingness on the part of employers to hire people with those skills that they actually need, rather than looking for people with formal degrees, which don't necessarily show that the people have the correct skills. So what you see today is that a large number of firms, very big ones like Amazon and Google, are offering training programs for very low cost for people who want to get into providing web services, providing other kinds of digital services, and people who take those courses can get entry into the digital production system without necessarily going to college.
Thank you so much, Professor Lawrence. Thanks so much for the presentation and the comprehensive Q&A as well. I would like to wrap up the event by reminding everyone again that our next speaker series is on Friday, April 22nd at our normal time, 12 Eastern, with Arsalan Metafar, Executive Director at JP Morgan's Development Finance Institution, on the topic of mobilizing capital markets towards sustainable development. We hope to see you there, and thank you, Professor Lawrence, for being on the speaker series event.